Now, it's relatively well known that INFJs and ENFPs have great potential for friendship and even relationships due to a certain kind of compatibility that, is not necessarily easy to anchor in theory or you can anchor it in observation, factual observation. These things happen, these connections take place. There tends to be a mutual attraction, a mutual sympathy, in the original sense of the word, between those two types. Even though those two types have no functions in common, the one thing they have in common is the NFTS kind of stack framework. They are intuitive, feeling, thinking, sensing in that order. Perhaps it's the case that that order sort of finds its mirror and discovers a potential for growth along the scale of each of the functions. Perhaps people would argue that you can explain that in terms of the shadow. There's many ways of trying to explain this. The empirical observation remains that those two types get on really well and tend to offer each other great potential for growth. This is something that I've discussed before. This is something that other channels have discussed before. So nothing really new here. But nevertheless, the fact is that it does happen that those relationships, whether friendly or more, but we can remain at the sort of friendship level here, sometimes they don't develop as much as they could. They kind of tend to peter out into inactivity and misunderstanding. It's not necessarily felt to be misunderstanding on both sides. Maybe one of the parties will feel like the other party is actually not that interested in continuing the relationship. But often that perception, most of the time, I have to say, it is a misunderstanding. Of course, this can happen. There can be ENFPs who are like, this INFJ, after all, it's not that interesting. I don't want to kind of get to know them in depth, and maybe that can be felt by the INFJ. These things can happen, of course, but I've just noticed that there are cases where misreading the other, because after all, we are two very different types. We might be complementary. I think we are complementary. Again, leaving aside questions of theory, trying to find in theory what the explanation is, we just empirically observe it. We can be good empiricists about this. Nevertheless, because those two types have no functions in common, I think that the danger, if you like, the risk of misreading each other exists. And I think the crucial area where this might happen, and therefore also the crucial area where you can find, if you like, corrective measures, is what I would call the game of hide and seek between the ENFP and the INFJ. And usually the game of hide and seek is led by the extrovert in the relationship, in the interaction, in the social interaction. So the ENFP is leading the hide and seek. So it's often a case of the ENFP just wanting to know more about the INFJ. They're really fascinated by the INFJ mind, and they are so keen to explore it under all its different facets. Okay. Now, the INFJ is also interested in the INFP mind, very fascinated by it as well, seeing a potential for growth in learning to see how an E functions and being inspired by it. They don't express it as readily, they won't be as proactive in manifesting their interest, but the very fact they engage is an indication that they are interested and that they want to pursue interacting. But this game of hide and seek is sometimes what leads to both parties misreading each other and not pursuing the interaction, which is a shame a lot of the time, because what happens typically is that the ENFP just asks questions and questions and questions and interacts, and the INFJ replies less and less. And so the ENFP ends up considering that the INFJ is not really interested in pursuing conversation. The INFJ is seeing that the ENFP is themselves no longer really engaging because they're thinking that the INFJ lost interest, is not proactive in trying to understand what's going on, so also assumes that the INFP's lost interest, the relationship peters out, and that's it, and that's a missed opportunity, because what originally caused the beginning of this decline, of this flagging intensity of the dynamic in the relation, is a false perception by the ENFP that the INFJ's response, the way of being, like these sparser and sparser replies, or longer and longer time between responses, is indicative of a loss of interest. And usually it's not that. Usually there's nothing to do with substance. It's a question of quantity. It's not a question of quality. You're probably doing just fine, but you might be quantitatively going a bit too strong, coming on a bit too strong on the INFJ. INFJs need time. If you bombard them with questions, even if they're super positive questions, you're really interested in what they're doing, it doesn't matter. Maybe they're super interesting stuff and you're absolutely excited to share that stuff. It's great, but you just have to learn to be a little bit more patient and to be a bit more piecemeal in, you got to control yourself maybe a tiny bit if you can. If this amounts to a complete defacing of the way you are, of your deep personality, your authentic self, don't do it if you feel that this would just be denature who you are. But if you don't feel that way, if you can just be, like I said, a little bit more gradual in how you engage the INFJ, the very same things you tell them, the very same questions you ask them, the very same bits of information you share with them are going to be of interest. So it's not a question of the quality of what you're saying. It's not a question of what you're saying not interesting them. It's like it gets a little bit too overstimulation. Sometimes when you pet a cat, they purr and they love it. And then after a while, they kind of start scratching you, right? Or even kind of lightly biting you because they get overly stimulated. It's not that they suddenly hate you or that they have been disliking the interaction so far. It's that, they just need you to just back off a little bit or give them a bit more space, Learning to calibrate your level of interaction with a cat is, I don't know how good that analogy is, but I'm sticking to it for now. You can understand the relationship with an INFJ in the same way. It needs to build piecemeal, needs to be gradual, and not just overwhelming to them. The quickness to overwhelm them is just like more abrupt, faster, more abrupt than it would be for an extrovert perceiver, naturally, because their extrovert perception function is lowest in their stack. It's not easy for them to acquire or to interact with lots of sensory information from the external world. When you interact with them, you ask them questions, that's interaction with the external world. For you, it's normal, it's your go-to, it's your efficiency when you're doing this. It's your second nature. It's not second nature for an INFJ. So keep this in mind, be more piecemeal. And I think that a lot of these great missed opportunities for budding relationships will be corrected or averted. So let me know in the comments what you think, if you've been through that kind of experience, and if you think that my advice is useful. Don't forget, I've written 2 books on the INFJs. So if you're an INFJ wanting to understand yourself more, the INFJ mind is deeply investigated in the ecstatic soul. The INFJ mind and the personality of the INFJ in the world today, hostile world felt by many INFJs to be hostile, is investigated in the Infinite Soul Manual book. You can get both. Know that you can leave a review of, if you have loved the book, please consider dropping a review, because I need more reviews for this book for reference purposes on Amazon. It really helps. If you're an ENFP, you were fascinated by INFJ as well, these 2 books will kind of help you understand INFJs more. I think at least that's my claim, So, and as always, do keep in mind that support in the form of donations is the lifeblood of my channel, keeps the channel going. So I'm really grateful to my current supporters. I have a Patreon link down there that you can click on, the one-off donation page that you can also click on via PayPal if you prefer that. Please consider it, and I will see you next time, guys. Take care. Bye-bye.